All right, hello everybody. Today we start with part one of two parts in our introduction to Buddhism, which is the focus of our subject matter and everything else this week. And so let's get into this. So there's a lot of, I think as I've mentioned when we were talking about Hinduism and Jainism, there's a lot of broad overlap when we're talking about these Eastern religions. They share a lot in common with their view of time, the cyclical nature of history, the nature of the samsara and breaking free of that cycle. And as we'll see, Buddhism is no different along those lines. It shares a lot in common with Jainism in that we might use the Sanskrit word dharma as a better term than strictly kind of religion. If you remember from Jainism, we were talking about how Jainism is not a religion that's really concerned with gods, in that gods that you put a face on, you put a name to, that you make a statue of or a painting. It's deeply interested in the spiritual. I mean, there are kind of otherworldly aspects about Jainism, obviously, but Buddhism is the same kind of way. And you'll hear from critics and religious scholars kind of wrestle with this. If you were to ask someone on the street, is Buddhism a religion? I think most people would say, well, of course it is. But it kind of comes down to that definition. How do you what are the qualifications for something to be a religion and something not? And so, since we're kind of in the weeds, this is our job in this course. I would say that Buddhism is more of a dharma than strictly a religion, a path for the individual to work his or her way to enlightenment or nirvana. Just as with Jainism, Buddhism is not a religion that's concerned with kind of the gods. Those aspects do creep into corners of the religion. Buddhism is way more complex and has way more kind of branches than we can hope to cover in a class like this. But by and large, like Jainism, it's not concerned with worshiping a god or a pantheon of gods. And certainly the Buddha himself never claimed any kind of divinity, and Buddhists do not recognize the Buddha as a god figure. So let's get into this. So unlike Jainism, Buddhism is grounded more historically, although it's kind of a quasi-history. And there is a clear founder. Siddhartha Gautama was his name. We know him as the Buddha, which is a term which translates to the enlightened one. He achieves this kind of this nirvana, this omniscience, in a way that ordinary mortals simply tend not to do. And I think most historians think that he probably was a real figure. Lived somewhere in the eastern part of India between the 6th and 4th centuries, and so it's a broad window of time. And when it gets down to it, it's difficult to pin down specific kind of knowable historical facts about the life of the Buddha. I think for the Buddhist, again, that's his historicity is secondary to the teachings that have been passed down in his name and in this tradition. And so for Buddhists, he's recognized as the one who achieves full enlightenment. The story goes is that he's given this chance to escape the cycle of samsara in this deep otherworldly meditation. And so he achieves this nirvana. And he's given the option to break free of his kind of human prison and be absorbed into kind of the ultimate reality. And the Buddha Gautama famously says, no, I am going to stay in this mortal world so I can share these ideas. And so he comes back, as it were, and spends his life helping others along the path and helping their people reduce their suffering and moving further down that path towards enlightenment. So, like I said, it's hard to speak historically about the Buddha. So we'll go with kind of what I take to be kind of the primary traditions. Born to a noble family in what we would call Nepal today. And his father, he seems to have come from a world of privilege, a life of wealth. He was born into the upper crust of society. His father was a great political or spiritual leader or both. And for the first half of the life, the story goes, is that he's kind of in the family compound. And he lives this life of wealth and indulgence, and he doesn't know any different. He's inside the compound, and he has no idea that the vast majority of the rest of the world does not live like that. And so he grows up as kind of this young prince with no notion of what most of humanity is going through. And then he breaks out. Usually the story goes around age 29. He sneaks out of the compound on 4 separate occasions. And on those trips, he respectively meets an old man, a sick man, a dead man, and a poor man. And so each of these kind of encounters represents kind of a huge wake-up call for Gautama. An old man. I think the stories that I've read, the idea is that he's so insulated at home that he doesn't even realize that what aging is, that people get old and they die. So he kind of sees mortality. He sees people getting sick. This didn't happen inside the compound with the best water and the best food. He sees death. He sees people die. He sees that the vast majority of humanity lives in struggling for food, for shelter, for money. And so he sees the real world for the first time, and he realizes that his life inside the rich family compound has been a lie for the most part. Maybe not an intentional harm done by his parents to him, but he sees it as a lie nonetheless, and he decides that he needs to leave home to really figure out what's going on. Now, if you remember from Jainism, there's a very, very similar story that's told about the Mahavir, the last of those Tirthankaras, those kind of holy men in Jainist tradition. And there's, to a degree that it can't be coincidence. The Mahavir, also born to privilege, rejects it and embraces a life of poverty, a life of meditation, a life of self-denial in the pursuit of a greater spiritual truth. In some ways, it's exactly what Gautama does, and they certainly stem from the same spiritual, if not historical, tradition. Now, certainly there are aspects of Buddha's life, if you were to travel to India and to Nepal, that certainly recognize the Buddha as a grounded historical figure. And again, largely speaking, there's no reason not to. It's just hard to speak in specific. So you see under the glass here a stone in Nepal, which the sign says the exact birthplace of the Buddha. And so there are archaeological sites that do lay claim to aspects of the life of the Buddha. Now, there are other kind of traditions too that point to, even before the Buddha comes along, signs and omens, and in this case a dream that presages the greatness of the Buddha. And so I just wanted to share with you the story of the dream of Mahamaya, who comes to be the mother of the Buddha. And there's lots of stories like these in religious traditions where there are signs and omens and dreams and miracles that precede the birth of the founder figure, as it were. So let's just read this. More than 2,500 years ago, there was a king called Suddhodana. He married a beautiful Kalian princess named Mahamaya. The couple ruled over the Sakyas, a warrior tribe living next to the Kaliya tribe in the north of India, in what is now known as Nepal. The capital of the Sakya country was laid out across the foothills of the Himalayas, the tallest mountain range in the world, and called Kapilavatthu. Queen Mahamaya was the daughter of King Ajana of the Koliyas, and such was her beauty that the name Maya, meaning vision, was given to her. But it was Maya's virtues and talents that were her most wonderful qualities, for she was endowed with the highest gifts of intelligence and piety. King Suddhodana was indeed worthy of his lovely wife. He himself was called King of the Law because he ruled according to the law. And there was no other man among the Sakyas more honored and respected. The king was admired by his nobles and courtiers as well as by the householders and merchants. Such was the noble family from which the Buddha was to arise. One full moon night, sleeping in the palace, the queen had a vivid dream. She felt herself being carried away by 4 divas. So you can even see in that Sanskrit word, it's the same root as our word divine. So there is talk of gods, so to speak, but they're still very undefined. Carried away to Lake Anatada in the Himalayas, which is a kind of mysterious kind of place of perfection, of creation in kind of Eastern folklore. After bathing her in the lake, the devas clothed her in heavenly cloths and anointed her with perfumes, and bedecked her with divine flowers. And soon after, a white elephant, a symbol of divinity, a unique, wondrous thing, holding a white lotus flower in its trunk, was that lotus again, appeared and went round her 3 times, entering her womb through the right side. The idea is that it kind of pierces her womb with a tusk, which it clearly has a kind of sexual imagery to it as well. Finally, the elephant disappeared and the queen awoke, knowing she'd been delivered an important message, as the elephant is a symbol of greatness in Nepal. The next day, early in the morning, the queen told the king about the dream. The king was puzzled and sent for some wise men to discover the meaning of his dream. The wise men said, "Your Majesty, you are very lucky. The Devas have chosen our queen as the mother of the purest one, and the child will become a very great being." The king and queen were very happy when they heard this. They were so pleased that they invited many of the noblemen in the country to the palace to a feast to tell them the good news. And even the needy were not forgotten. Food and clothes were given to the poor people in celebration. The whole kingdom waited eagerly for the birth of the new prince, and Queen Maya enjoyed a happy and healthy pregnancy, living a pure life for herself and her unborn child. So the child, of course, is Gautama, who becomes the Buddha. And you notice that he comes from good stock, a king who is wise and kind and gracious and generous, a queen who is both beautiful and intelligent and pious. Lays the groundwork for the kind of man that the Buddha would become. Yeah, here's a drawing of the dream. So here we have Mahamaya in all of her kind of splendorous royal glory, fanned and waited upon by various attendants. And there's the dream of the white elephant up there in the sky, above the Himalayas, the mountain range, associated with touching the heavens. Okay, so back to Gautama. He escapes from the palace, having had these 4 trips where he realizes he has these epiphanies, these tragic epiphanies about the true nature of human suffering. And he deliberately rejects his inheritance and pursues a life of poverty and begging. His parents are horrified, and even though, with these prophecies that he would become this pure holy man, they never envisioned that it would look like this. They never envisioned that it would mean him kind of breaking from the family, but he does. And so Siddhartha refuses to come back home. He looks for wisdom through various ascetic teachers who kind of remove themselves from society, and experiments with deeper experiences of meditation. He feels like he's getting somewhere, but at the end of the day, he doesn't find what he's looking for, so to speak. Now, one tradition says that he pushes this self-deprivation to an absolute ultimate. Get to a point where he's only allowing himself 1 leaf or nut for food, a couple of drops of water for liquids, and he nearly dies. He collapses, and he almost drowns in a shallow puddle of water. And when he finally wakes up from this and recovers, he realizes that this isn't right. There has to be a better way. There has to be what he famously called a middle path. Neither the wealth and privilege that separates you from most of humanity, but neither the destitution of the extreme end of poverty, where you suffer until you die tragically. Is there something in the middle? And that's where kind of his great insight starts to take place. So the most famous story about the Buddha is that this 49-day experience of silent meditation, usually under a Bodhi tree or a peepal tree. These symbols of piety and heavenly connection in India and Nepal. And at the end of that meditation, he becomes awake, and he achieves nirvana. However you might imagine that. In one sense, the idea is that in that moment, he understands kind of the full cycle of samsara. He has kind of this, the way I like to kind of think about it is it's almost like he has this bird's eye view from a divine place. And he sees how all things are connected. He sees the whole cycle of samsara rather than just being kind of limited to kind of his narrow tunnel vision at one point on the circle. And he realizes kind of all of the connections and all the things that prevent humanity from progressing towards a release, towards moksha, as we've seen it called. And for him, it was rooted in the quenching of desires and sufferings, out of which come all the things that hold human beings back: hatred, ignorance, violence, war, bodily indulgence. All these things keep the cycle going and don't free you. So what he does, another way that, just like with Jainism, I talked about it in some ways because of more organized Hinduism. I think you could apply that kind of general name to Buddhism as well, and I mean no offense by that at all. But I think one of the things that appeals to people about Buddhism is that it's very manageable. It has 4 noble truths. There's an 8-fold path. You attend to your 3 jewels. It's kind of a list that you can follow that kind of pares things down and gets you away from kind of the wild, rampant complexity that we saw under the umbrella of Buddhism. So as a result of his awakening, the Buddha kind of recognized, okay, the doctrine of reincarnation, samsara, moksha, yes, what society has, his society, Eastern society, Indian society, has taught and followed for centuries is correct. But one thing that he did come out against was the caste system. He says that is inherently unjust. This idea that you're born into a particular level and you're at that level because of what you did in the past. It's your fault if you're in the lowest caste. Or to your credit that you're in the highest caste. The Buddha says that can't be a part of any kind of just society. And so he says what human beings can do then, anyone, from the top of the food chain to the bottom of the food chain, you can move towards a higher consciousness. You can move down that path. And the first thing that you do is you acknowledge what he called the Four Noble Truths. And here are their Sanskrit names: dukkha, samudaya, nirodha, and magga. And I have a nice slide that kind of breaks these down very nicely. And what is the first noble truth? Dukkha. This is probably the most famous maxim of Buddhism. Suffering exists. Or you'll often hear a phrase, life is suffering. That needs to be accepted. Life includes pain, getting old, disease, you die. We'll endure psychological suffering like loneliness, frustration, boredom, fear, embarrassment, disappointment, and anger. So recognize that, accept that life is suffering. And this idea that you don't do yourself any favors by avoiding that, pretending that. I think this is it's a real challenge, I think, to kind of secular, kind of liberalized Western society. We're a very suffering-avoidant culture. Why would you suffer? Who wants to feel pain? There's a pill for that. There's a distraction for that. Buddhism says no. The way to a meaningful life, the way to move down the path towards a higher consciousness is to embrace suffering, face it, deal with it, learn from it, go through it. It's a very kind of hero's journey way of doing things. You don't walk the hero's journey without facing that darkness. What is the second noble truth? Samudaya. There is cause for suffering. So if life is suffering, where does it come from? It's caused by craving and the need to control things. Desire is the root of it, and it can take many forms. To desire to be famous, to be recognized, to avoid unpleasantness, to avoid fear, anger, or jealousy. So a desire is for things that you want for yourself that you think will help you. A desire to push things away that won't help you. All those have the deep potential to lead you off the path. The third noble truth, nirodha, there is an end to suffering. So there's kind of promise on the other side of this. The third truth is that suffering can be overcome and happiness can be attained. That true happiness and contentment are possible if we let go of our craving and learn to live each day at a time, not dwelling on the past or imagined future. Buddhism is a very now-focused religion or path. Is that this idea that the past is the past, there's nothing that you can do about it. And the future, there's no sense in worrying about the future because it's so unknown. And even though you think you might try to plan for it and prepare for it and get a handle on it, I think that's a very Western idea. The truth of the matter is you really can't. So be here now is another phrase you'll hear kind of associated with Buddhism. So if we live in the moment and we let go of these cravings, we learn how to do that, we will become happy and we will become free. The fourth noble truth, magga, in order to end suffering, you must follow the Eightfold Path. So it ends, the third noble truth is a promise. There's an end to this. And the fourth noble truth is, this is the way you do it. So the four truths point you to the Eightfold Path. And this slide kind of, here, this is the Eightfold Path. These kind of right beliefs, ways of thinking, action, that group around, various aspects of kind of the religion of Buddhism: wisdom, morality, and concentration. So wisdom, kind of believing the right things. Morality, kind of acting in a way that will improve not only your own life but others' life, and then concentration, which are more kind of practical ways of getting around us. So let's just walk through these briefly. So right understanding. Our actions have consequences. Know this. Death is not the end. There are consequences beyond death. So having a right idea of the place of humanity, the meaning of what it means to be human, how you have an effect on others, and what does perhaps lie beyond. Right aspiration, wanting the right things. Reject the comforts of home. Adopt a life of peaceful renunciation in a non-sensual environment. So Buddhism, at its root, teaches that stuff isn't going to make you happy. Again, that's a very a Western idea that that all our advertisement promises. If you get this product, then you will find meaning. If you do this, if you subscribe to that, then happiness is just a click away. Buddhism says no, it's all a lie. And so what you do is you live a life of kind of not like I don't think the Buddha would say of poverty and begging to the extreme that you saw like the Jainist monks would do, but you would see this idea of living simply, live a very simple life, recognizing that things only make you suffer more, make you want more things. Right speech, yes, very Jainist here. Don't lie, don't gossip, keep your language pure and not crude. Right action, don't kill, don't injure, don't steal, control your sexual impulses, no material desires. So again, I wouldn't say maybe to the extreme of kind of the ahimsa that we saw in Jainism, the do no harm, but right in that ballpark. There's a lot of overlap. 5, right livelihood, possess only what you need to live, beg to eat. This is Buddhists would disagree about this, but there is kind of a Jainist aspect to Buddhism that rely on the charity of others. Don't exploit somebody else to make money to buy your food. Recognize that this life will provide what you need if you're following the path correctly. Right, for guard against sensual thoughts, anything that might disrupt your meditation. Again, meditation just like to mimic, to follow the life of the Buddha, not with the idea that you become another Buddha, but you imitate the Buddha. Meditation is a way of centering yourself, reducing your desires, of moving further down the path. 7, right, mindfulness. Be here now. Be fully present. Be conscious of what you are doing at all times. Enjoy the moment. Don't beat yourself up about what you did yesterday or 5, 10, 20 years ago. And don't wring your hands over the future. So this idea that you can't control what you can't control. So be here now. And number 8, right, concentration. Develop the discipline of meditation. Develop meditative practice and discipline as the primary way of centering yourself, of beginning your day, of connecting with the divine, of moving yourself down the path towards enlightenment, as it were. So we have the 4 Noble Truths, we got the 8-fold path, and then the last one here, the 3 jewels, which you'll often hear in kind of Buddhist ritual or like a Buddhist meditation service or prayer service. A meditator might begin by saying, I take refuge in my Buddha, I take refuge in my Dharma, and I take refuge in my religious community. It's this idea, I take refuge in my Buddha, this idea that Gautama, the enlightened one, is kind of the ultimate example of how one lives one life. But again, without going as far as saying the Buddha is divine. Buddhists do not worship Buddha. He never claimed any kind of divinity for himself. Refuge in my Dharma, my path. Everybody's Dharma is going to look a little bit different. And the way you do this, the way you do this is going to be different than maybe your fellow Buddhist is going to do it. And so you have your own path to walk. At the end of the day, it's only you that can do this. And the refuge in my religious community, this idea that you walk your own individual path, but in a broader sense, you are also not alone. So yes, meditate, pray, chant, congregate with other meditators, with other Buddhists, as a way of helping others along the journey, allowing others to help you. All right, that does it for part 1. In part 2, we'll kind of talk more about kind of specific expressions of Buddhism, going back to kind of its historical roots and how they continue to this very day. I'll try to touch upon some of the broad complexity of say, Buddhism as it expresses itself today. But like I said earlier in this lecture, it's such a radically complex subject that we can only kind of scratch the surface here. The textbook does a good job of outlining some of these things, but Buddhism, in as much as it brings us to a much more simple approach to divinity than, say, Hinduism does, it's still really, really complex at the end of the day. All right, see you next time.